The title of today's talk is Improving and Protecting Our Creeks and Lakes. In April of 2016, the city of Prescott embarked on an ambitious planning effort to study Watson Lake and the upper portions of the Granite Creek watershed. This May, those two planning efforts will come to a close and produce management plans for improving the water quality of Watson Lake and many of the creeks that feed it. Our speaker today is Matt Killeen, the Environmental Coordinator for the City of Prescott. He will describe the study results and planned pollution reduction strategies that the city will utilize going forward. Mr. Killeen will also discuss some of the partnerships, projects, and opportunities that will impact these waters and what the public can do to help improve the quality of Prescott's creeks and lakes. Matt.
I'm Matt Killeen, and I am the Environmental Coordinator for the City of Prescott. A brief backstory on myself. How did I end up coming here? It was family that brought me here. The opportunity for my kids to spend quality time with my folks was a big part of it. But prior to that, I spent 15 years down along the southern border of Arizona, managing riparian nature preserves, working with ranchers, land trusts in the southeast corner. And that's where my affinity and kind of professional history led me to this position. And it was titled Environmental Coordinator because I'm not sure if they really knew what to call it when it came about. They just knew they needed somebody to deal with these creeks and lakes. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. The first third of the presentation is kind of a history of how we got to this point we're at today. So we're going to be thinking about what are the causes, what are the impairments, what are the cities and the regulatory pressures that lead us to action, and so what those look like, transition that into our planning activities. Once we realized these were issues that we had to address, what were the next steps? So that middle third, once again, we're going to be talking about the formal planning efforts and what is pointing us towards the type of activities that will be in the near future. Some of those are kind of singular construction projects, others will be more kind of behavioral, operational things that we do as a city or as we do as a community. Hey, welcome. You're just in time. And then finally, even though we're going through this planning process, we are doing a lot of these things proactively. And so we're going to touch on some of those things that are happening under our very noses right now. And I'm happy to see a number of folks tied into those efforts are here today as well. So they'll even be able to answer questions towards the end of this, hopefully. And then finally, I think it's always important to have that think globally, act locally, and even on an individual level. So what can we do, whether it's the rain barrels in the front yard? What can we do individually to help this larger effort? Because it is going to take a community effort as well as governmental action on a number of these levels. So to take us way back, this is what Prescott looked like before we all kind of started coming here. And so the natural water cycle was in place, and that did an incredible job of filtering our water. Pollutants were dispersed and were actually, consumed as part of the soil profile. We had, accessible floodplains. We had natural flood cycles. All of these things worked very well together to maintain a high level of water quality. But times change. And with that come a lot of other things. And so if we look at this repeat photography here, just in our downtown, probably right about on the corner of the Elks Theater, the pictures strike me in a number of ways. Going from dirt roads to paved roads, looking at the number of people or vehicles on that upper picture versus what we see in the lower. It's an order of magnitude difference. And with that,
all those impervious, the paved roads, the sidewalks, the rooftops. Downtown Prescott is a concrete jungle in many cases. And what that does is it reflects the density of humans that we have here and all of our stuff that comes with it, whether it's the pets or our own infrastructure. And then it also creates this incredibly efficient manner of transporting pollutants through that gutter line down into what is our storm drain system. And ultimately that is those blue squiggly lines on the map here. Those are our local creeks. And so they do not benefit from any filtration prior to receiving those stormwater runoff events. So what that means is, as I'm pointing to this top left picture here on Miller Creek, that kind of speaks to the efficiency with which we're transporting pollutants directly to our creeks. This is in the downtown area. And then we also are constricting our creeks. And so this is looking south at the Goodwin Street Bridge, and there is almost zero accessible floodplain there. So whereas water would previously have spread out, sunk in, it's rushing straight down the middle. And then along with us, excuse me, on the top right picture here, I'm looking at a sewer manhole right in the creek bottom. As Prescott is blessed with all of these creeks, it was also identified as an easy way to transport our sewer waste down to a central location near the Sundog treatment plant near the Peavine Trailhead. So a vast majority of our creeks have sewer lines running straight down them. That's the way gravity flows, right? Follow the water. And so that's one more component that we look at in terms of impacting the quality of water that runs through our creeks. Well, we were not unique in experiencing this. The whole nation experienced it. Famously, the Cuyahoga River and the industrial pollutants that we were realizing back in the day spurred the nation to action in the form of the Clean Water Act in 1972. And with it came get ready for the first of many acronyms. I'm a government official, so I'm obligated to just throw them at you on a regular basis. The NPDES permit is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And what it did is it created a permit system where certain user groups were obligated to get permits to minimize the amount of pollution that they were creating and transporting to the waterways or infrastructure of the United States. So the three main kind of formats for that are construction sites, industrial sites, and then municipal sites. And we fall into that municipal site, also known as MS4 or Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Permit. So in the case of Prescott, our sanitary sewer system and our storm drain system are independent and non-connected series of pipes, catch basins, and in parts back east, you'll see combined systems where they are all going to a singular kind of treatment facility, and those are particularly prone to heavy rain, overflows, and so, but we have these separate systems. And so what the EPA effectively said is, as a municipality who owns those streets, those curbs, those gutters, those catch basins, you are responsible for minimizing the amount of pollutants that are going down into our water bodies. And in doing so, you have a series of control measures that you are obligated to enact on a regular basis to do that. And that's where these 6 minimum control measures come in. And so instead of just solely looking at identifying sources of pollution and eliminating them, they took a broader approach to it, realizing it takes things like, in that top left corner, the public education and outreach, public involvement and participation, the identification, elimination of pollution, as well as some others that aren't quite as applicable here today, but that whole left column we'll be addressing today. So that's part of what really is the foundation of my position with the city, is making sure that this program runs and improves the quality of our water. Another regulatory kind of guiding force, the EPA through the Clean Water Act delegated to Arizona's Department of Environmental Quality the responsibility to establish standards for our water bodies in terms of water quality. And so they look at a broad spectrum of pollutants and establish what reasonable rates of pollution are. And they are identified by the use of the water body. So it's split between high elevation, low elevation, and then warm waters, cold waters, and then also the full body contact standard, agricultural standards. All of these have different targets where above which you are considered to be an impaired water body. And this is a very washed out slide identifying the Prescott area and our impairments or non-attaining water bodies. And those are really one and the same. It's mostly kind of a semantic issue of definition, non-attaining versus impairment. But over time, we became a hotspot really throughout the state. There's no other municipality that I'm aware of looking at ADEQ maps that have the number of impaired waterways that we do here. It started back in 2004 when the EPA was still in charge of identifying our polluted waterways, and they looked at Granite Creek and found that it was an exceedance for both E. coli, which is a fecal indicator, and dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen has a number of possible reasons behind it. But as DEQ, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, kind of took over the program, they really recognized that we had a potential issue here. And so put a lot more focus on our area. And as you can see, over the years up until 2016, which is the most recent listing, we've got 12 creeks that are listed as impaired. And that's for a full body standard for E. coli. Our impaired lakes have a kind of a different set of issues associated with them, and it's much more artificial lakes or reservoirs tend to be nutrient sinks if not managed proactively and appropriately. And so in those cases, ammonia, in the case of Willow Creek Reservoir, and for Watson Lake, nitrogen, low DO, high pH were the identified pollutants. And the listing that Arizona Department of Environmental Quality puts about every 2 years is based on watersheds, so we fall within the Verde watershed. And this is just an example of that. And I do have the link down below if you're interested in seeing what the Verde watershed looks like from an impairment perspective. It also lists water bodies that have no impairments, that are meeting all applicable water quality standards. And so this goes through and provides you, a number of information points, so where the listing originated from up top, where it falls, category 4A is not attaining, and which is an impairment, and then the different exceedances that it has been observed, and it gives recommendations and other things like what future monitoring targets should be. So once you've kind of defined the nature of your impairments, the Department of Environmental Quality prioritized across the state what all of these impairments look like and say, these are our priority watersheds or water bodies, and we need to effectively create a plan that identifies the nature of these pollutants and how much pollution we need to reduce to get to the water quality standard. And it also prescribes who is responsible for those water quality reductions. TMDL, another acronym here, is total maximum daily load. So that's essentially the prescription of the maximum amount of pollutants that would be allowable and still maintaining your basic water quality standards so that you could go swimming in a creek or a lake. So in our watershed, they ended up identifying both Watson Lake and the upper Granite Creek watershed. Excuse me. As you can see, for our impaired creeks, all of those are within our upper Granite Creek watershed or above Watson Lake. And so rather than dealing with those independently, they realized that the pollutants of concern and the issues that they were facing were all similar enough that they could be addressed in a single document, which makes a lot of sense. So with that load, both those TMDL documents for the lake and the watershed, and the city's own strategic plan identifying clean water bodies as a quality of life indicator, the city recognized just prior to my arrival that we needed to take a more comprehensive and scientific approach to how we're going to deal with these pollutants. And at that point in time, we engaged a consultant out of the Phoenix area, Amick Foster Wheeler, who's subsequently been bought by Wood, so I'll refer to him interchangeably here as we go. And we created with them an action plan to address these pollutants, to help meet the goals of those TMDL documents. And as you know, the two TMDL documents dealt with the lake and the Granite Creek watershed, we've kind of split this into two. We've gone through those first initial, which was really an intensive data collection and modeling effort. And we're not completely done with the modeling effort yet, but we'll get into that here briefly. But looking forward, the next thing that we have due here are these tasks 6 and 7. So we're creating a model of the nutrient cycling, which are the pollutants of concern for Watson Lake. And we're looking at how that varies seasonally and relative to different strategies for how we would address them. In the watershed case, we're on the verge of a watershed pollution reduction plan, which looks at different BMPs. It summarizes our model findings, and it kind of sets a course going forward for a number of different approaches on how we can deal with some of these. And I'll touch on some of these here briefly. And then the final deliverable of this will be a Watson Lake management plan. And that's going to be a very interesting effort and coordination because we've got multiple interests that are aligned with that lake. Everybody feels connected to it, from the people who count every drop in terms of our water quality, Department of Water Resources, from the recreational community that have spoken vocally in recent years about that whole area. Everybody feels connected to that lake. And so we need to make sure as we go forward that our activities are considerate of those other interests and complementary to one another. And those are our final two deliverables, both of which are due in May. We were hoping it would come earlier, but nothing does. So to speak on some of the watershed modeling that we're doing, we realized we didn't have capacity internally, and we also wanted some objectivity of external scientists looking at the way our watershed performs and what our vulnerabilities are, what our faults are, what are the things that we can attack from an operational standpoint to improve it. And the way that they're currently doing it is kind of breaking it down into two interacting modeling components. The first is the Loading Simulation Program, which is an acronym, again, LSPC. That's looking at those outer portions of our watershed that are not paved over yet, that are acting in a more historic and natural way. So how water and particulate matter load off of those natural forest areas that we find south of town near White Spar Trailhead or to the east by Thumb Butte, to the west by Thumb Butte. And then the other one is the symptom model, simplified particulate transport model. This is an interesting one in that it looks at all of our paved areas and how pollutants both collect and move across it. What type of rain events does it take to wash those down into our water bodies? That picture in the bottom left corner is us actually going out and collecting street dirt to calibrate those models to make sure they're reflective of our setting here. there are not a lot of analogs that we can find out there to readily plug in our place due to our elevation, the topography we have, and the sheer number of water bodies we have. So we want to make sure that these models are reflective of our setting. And in that case, we're right near the junction of Park Avenue and Copper Basin, right on the banks of Aspen Creek. We actually go out, this was a summer or two ago now, and identify a 10 to 15 meter stretch and shop vac every piece of dirt from that gutter line, and then break it down into a particle analysis by sieve. And the reason we do that is that those different particle sizes have affinities for different pollutants. And so the nutrients that are impairing our lake in particular, the nitrogen likes a certain particle size, the phosphorus likes another one. And so by getting a sense of where these different particles are within our city, we can start thinking about how to address them or where we should address them for the kind of greatest cost benefit. And in doing so, we don't look at just completely random streets. We break it down based on type. You know, commercial streets versus industrial streets versus residential. What does it look like up in Timber Ridge versus down on downtown area on Cortez and Goodwin, say. Each one of those areas have kind of a different personality and flavor. And so identifying what those are will help us come up with better strategies going forward. Since all of our creeks are impaired for E. coli, one of the things we wanted to do was look at microbial source tracking. So E. coli is a very common bacteria that is in the gut of just about every warm-blooded animal out there. And so the reason that the EPA identified it as an indicator is that the tests for doing it are relatively cheap and easy. And so you can do a lot of testing to really develop a data set to inform you as to where your pollutants could be coming from. The downside is that those pollutants could be coming from deer, javelina, Fido that's out on a walk with you, any number of things, javelina, all of these things are contributing E. coli. Now, if you look at that earlier impervious area, the density of us is the greatest. And so if we're gonna play the odds, we're probably looking in the mirror about where these sources are coming from. But we also want to have a better sense of what are the other things that we can and can't manage for within the watershed. And so we're still in a draft phase of that, but it's informative. And what we've realized is this is the type of data that we actually need to do on a repeated basis. And we're looking at developing local capacity, hopefully, so that these tests are not one-off, because they really do just capture currently just one snapshot in time, and how it looks now versus how it looks in the summertime before monsoon, when all the javelina and deer are down in the creeks, when everybody's congregating to those wet areas for their sustenance, may look a little bit different. On the lakefront, this planning effort wanted to make sure we had a really comprehensive data set to look at the year-long nutrient cycling. Basically, that history, the lake has a history of treated water from the Sundog wastewater treatment plant going in. This used to be an irrigation, Chino Valley irrigation reservoir. The fact that it had extra nutrients wasn't a downside for the irrigators that were to the north of us. That was feeding their crops. But when the city bought it, we also bought all those nutrients that had been built up for nearly 100 years. At one point in time, Watson Lake was identified as one of the most eutrophic lakes, which meaning it's just these high nutrient loads that kind of have a negative feedback cycle that continually they go through and have these incredible blooms of algae and aquatic weeds and die-offs in the summer, the decomposition. Those nutrients stay in place, they feed off each other, and it just kind of goes round and round and round. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a really comprehensive data set to be complementary to the data sets that formed the total maximum daily load document. And so we did a year-round, 5 spots on the lake, multiple depths at each spot, looking at a whole host, 26 parameters in all. I've got just 2 of them really demonstrated here. So on the bottom left corner, we're looking at our dissolved oxygen relative to depth. And up near the surface, it's a little bit counterintuitive. So the surface of our water is right about here, and this is the oxygen on this axis here. And so what happens is, as you start to get a little deeper in the water, basically to about the 10-foot area, there's virtually no accessible oxygen below that point. And when we think about it from a resource perspective, you basically cut off at least the bottom half of the lake to your aquatic animals, whether you're fish or otherwise. And so that has pretty significant impacts for other things in terms of our ability to enjoy it. It limits the occupiable habitat for fish. And then it also has potential with regards to fish die-offs, which were realized in 2010, I believe it was. So what are these things going to bring back to us? Where does the rubber meet the road? And I think for those planning activities, we took them on realizing that these are not going to be nickel-dime solutions. These are going to be expensive. And if we're going to be spending our community's money, our resources on these things, we should really have some solid science behind us to prioritize these things as we go. And so that's kind of the measure twice, cut once philosophy that we're bringing to this. So the watershed pollution reduction plan, this will be coming before the lake management plan. And one of the reasons for that it's staggered slightly, is that we realize that the watershed, what we do in the watershed gets to the lake eventually. It's kind of commonsensical, but realizing that the watershed reduction plan needs to address not only the E. coli, but also the nutrient transport to our lakes. So we anticipate that coming next month, actually. And so we'll be looking at a whole host of best management practices that can be applied to our upper watershed. So we're not far from either North Fork of Miller or Miller Creek here. What are some of the things that we can do so that those water bodies are not transporting nutrients, so we're minimizing the amount of E. coli that gets to them? And so, as I mentioned, it'll be for both. The other thing that was attractive to this consultant and what they proposed is that the modeling that they're doing is iterative. It's not a snapshot in time. We're currently on the second modeling iteration, where data that we've collected out in the field doing our own water quality monitoring is getting pushed back into that system. Any data that they can glean from any source is helping inform us as we go to help tighten that model up to make it more reflective, not only of the additional water quality data, but also additional best management practices, things like the Acker detention basin, which I'll get to here shortly. And so ultimately, we envision that this is going to have 2 different kind of outcomes going forward. One will be a stormwater capital campaign going forward. So just as we do with streets, we would have a whole 5-year outlook on projects that would improve our water quality at different parts within the watershed. And I'll touch on what some of those may look like. And others are really more designed to help what would otherwise be regular budgetary expenditures. I didn't realize it, but there's a whole science behind street sweepers. And so we've got 3. One of them is an antiquated kind of bristle brush that basically just kind of pushes things around. That's kind of the very bare bones of it. It can kind of move some stuff, but a lot of it still stays. These things are, entry price alone is $300,000. That doesn't include the cost of maintenance or the equipment operator that's sitting in it and driving it 7 hours a day. So this is not an insignificant one-time expense or long-term expense when you think about the personnel that's associated with that. Other things that come with this is that the two favored models are a vacuum and a regenerative air. And regenerative air is really cool. It kind of uses a cyclone effect. And so it's sucking air, sucking the dirt off of it, putting that dirt through a filter, and then that air then gets blasted to help loosen the dirt on the streets to feed the vacuum again. And so it's kind of a cool circle. It's a little bit more efficient. Now, the thing about that is those tend to be really good for the whole lane width or the width of that vehicle. And most of our pollutants, most of the time, if you exclude our recent cinder flurry, most of our pollutants are really found within the first 36 inches of the curb line because of the crowns of our roads. And it's the vacuum trucks, which have an exhaust out somewhere else, doesn't feed back into that cleaning cycle, that really focuses on that first 36 inches. So we need to be smart about identifying what our fleets, we currently have 3, including the antiquated one. They're all old and regularly in fleet services, and so we're about due. But how do we diversify our fleet to make sure that we are able to take on both of those instances where we've got whole street width dirt versus the more common everyday occurrence that we see as we have the weekly sweepings in downtown, where it's really limited to that gutter line. So these are the kind of things where when we go before our leaders and city manager and council, we need to be able to identify, look, this is a big ask from a budgetary standpoint, but here are the benefits, and this is how we're going to use them. Not only that we need this type of truck, but where are we going to send it through town to maximize the benefit of those 7 hours a day that that operator is driving. Some of the other strategies that we really anticipate to be recommended along with this are visible just about a half block to the south of us at the rodeo grounds. That was a green infrastructure project that came online just about 3 years ago. And so basically, as we look at that impervious city, we're trying to identify opportunities to slow the water down, spread it out, and sink it in. Just as you've got the active rainwater harvesting, you've also got passive rainwater harvesting where you're using the natural contours of your landscape. We're needing to do this now on neighborhood scales and in places that the city owns, like the rodeo grounds, where we know we've got a really big pollutant source. We've got a ton of horses and cattle and fairs and other things that go on there. And so intercepting that before it hits Miller Creek is a primary concern. And this was a project that was funded through Department of Environmental Quality, Water Quality Improvement Grant. And as you can see, water enters from that far side, western side, and is forced to go through kind of a serpentine path rather than doing a straight line through. The fall over the course of that is very minimal. There's another water input that comes from the bottom left corner here, and actually is going through, albeit a straight channel, but a long vegetated channel that goes all the way around to that far end. And on that far end, we actually have a settling bay, so the sediments drop out. We extract those and measure them, weigh them over, and we take them out about twice a year before monsoon and then about 6 months later. So we're trying to get a sense of how much sediment we're intercepting. That's one way of putting some metrics on it. Another way is we worked with Department of Environmental Quality to have what are called first flush samplers. There's one here, and there's one here just after that weird 4-bay wall. And what we're doing there is these are set in tubes in the ground that allow us, when that first pulse of water comes through, we're capturing it the upstream area where it's had very minimal treatment, down to that bottom area where it's had more time for those fine sediments to settle out. We're still waiting on DEQ for the results of that, but a more immediate indicator of it, my colleague Orrin Thomas, who's in the back left corner, has been a watchdog on our waters and doing a lot of really innovative water quality monitoring. And so this is a more recent sampling, and just using our kind of turbidity as an indicator of how much stuff is in our water, You can see this is the sample that was taken right about where that fence post is, just as that water's entering. This is where it's leaving. We do duplicate samples. It's a quality control in the field. And you're going from this to this, but we need to be thinking about it across the board. And to me, what's really telling is where once upon a time, the difference between, let me back up. So these two samples are above and below where this feature drops into Miller Creek. So we're looking at above before this pollutant surge and below. And so historically, I think that this would not have been anywhere near as close as it is now. We've got some dilution at play with the volume of Miller Creek versus the smaller volume here, but I think it would be much more visible. And so the idea that the above this feature and below this feature to the naked eye are negligible, it tells me we're in the right direction. We're not there yet by any means, but this is one of many features that we need to be thinking about inserting throughout town. So we anticipate this will be one of the many strategies that our watershed pollution reduction plan will point us to. This one's an interesting recent development, the Acker Park Regional Detention. Has anybody been out to see this? Anyone? It's kind of a big hole in the ground. I mean, it's a little bit intimidating at first. It came about through a really cool cooperative effort. With all these creeks and the constriction that we have running through town, it puts an incredible number of people who live closest to those creeks in the floodway. And so they have to deal with higher insurance rates, flooding events. And so this was an effort between the Yavapai County Flood Control District and the city. And there's a private party in play here as well. Tenney Ranch is the development just to the south of this. It's accessible. It's right across Senator Highway from Hazley Road. And they're still finishing their build out there. So when new development comes into the city, we have both water quality requirements and stormwater volume requirements. And those two can work together many times. The most common way of addressing it is through detention ponds. And so detention provides that percolation, trapping the sediment, so there's your water quality. And then it's preventing that large rush of volume from the street surfaces and rooftops from impacting your structures or the creek below. And what Tenney Ranch realized was that they were having to give up entire lots to meet the detention requirements. And those lots were just more valuable to them in another fashion. Our city code actually allows, it's 16-6, and it's called a fee in lieu of detention. And so what this does is that we work with the private developers, and they say, look, we would rather not have detention here because our profit margins are based on maximizing our footprint. Can we do it? So there's a question of safety to the downstream people. If it's doable, we can say sure, and one of the options to waive that is that you pay us for that detention. That goes into our aquifer protection fee, and we're able to utilize that for things like the previous slide of the rodeo biobasin. So we've got a whole series of these small green infrastructure projects that are getting lined up. So as we try to utilize this feature more, we can turn around and put that back into the ground so that it's not just sitting in a bank somewhere. Let's see that realized as soon as possible on the ground. Now, this feature, with the flood control district, they're looking at remapping it and are likely going to be pulling a number of folks out of the floodplain so they'll realize lower insurance rates. But we are also tracking it for water quality benefits. And it's still, when it comes to restoring a site like this that was just scoured out, excavated, it's not as quick as you ever want it to be. And actually what we're doing here, that's Orrin down in the basin, or is it me? I forget. But we're actually trying out some kind of experimental transplants using some aquatic vegetation that dates back, or semi-aquatic vegetation, dates back to the Devonian era, scouring rush. It excretes silica from the sand. It It does a great job of kind of taking over these wetted areas and is great at scour protection for your banks. It's browse resistant because it excretes the silica, so it's like chewing on sandpaper. So it was used historically for cleaning out pots, and thus the name scouring rush. Also called horsetail, it's an equisetum. And so we're wanting to, at the early days, just kind of experiment with some of these things to see, can we work on that? Because those plants are also eating off of the nitrogen and phosphorus that get deposited with our flood flows. And so just over this winter with some of our flows in the bottom right corner, it's not quite repeat photography, but this is the area, this is the main input to the detention basin. And down below here, we have an entire alluvial fan of sediments that have been dropped there. And so typically, these would have continued on downstream. They would have impacted local properties, potentially transporting pollutants all the way down to the lake itself. So we're intercepting that here, and we're learning how to do maintenance on these kind of features, because this will build up over time and we can fill that whole basin in over a grand period of time. And so we're going to be going in and extracting that and reapplying it to places that are scoured out throughout the park. And hopefully, as nutrient-rich soil like that, those areas that we're applying to in the park would also have the benefit of resprouting. So the seeds and vegetative bits that come down with that would have an opportunity to resprout or be viable beds for the wind-blown grass seed and other similar type things. So this is really in its infancy. We're about a year removed from the completion, and we're really looking forward to this spring and summer to see what vegetation comes back, where we need to give it some nudges to help it in that process. So the trees are doing well. We'll see how the rest goes. So in addition to brand new green infrastructure projects like the Rodeo Basin, where it was like, we go through a planning process, there's the design, let's construct it in place, similar with the detention basin. This is one that Prescott Creeks, Michael Bird, who's here in attendance as well, really took a valuable lead on kind of showing us all how you can create new infrastructure, but at the same time utilize existing infrastructure and retrofit it to have benefit for stormwater. Not only for trapping those pollutants, but watering the gardens that we love to sit and stroll amongst. And so this is something that we've actually developed a menu ourselves now of a number of sites through town where we can do these kind of retrofits into our open spaces, our parks, and say, hey, let's take advantage of, rather than spending money on irrigating turf in Flynn Park, let's do some curb cuts so that we can use stormwater down there effectively. And in doing so in those areas, when we slow it, spread it, and sink it, we're also helping populate the nearby Miller Creek as well. So lake treatments. Now, when everybody, there's a whole bunch of them, and when everybody thinks of aeration, they always imagine these golf course type, pretty spray things. And while that's not been eliminated, on large lakes like Watson, it's much more often these submersible ones that are hoses down to the bottom that provide that kind of aeration. As we pointed out earlier in one of those graphs, we have about below 10 feet, there's virtually no oxygen available. So getting that stuff to cycle will be an important part, adding oxygen to it for the benefit of the fish and overall water quality. Well, it is one of the things that I would not be surprised to come down in this report that we're anticipating. This is a one that I kind of get a kick out of. It's basically a lawnmower for your lake. And the idea behind it has multiple benefits. This is something that Rec Services, Joe Bain's crew, actually came to me at one point in time and said, hey, we've got concerns because we've got people on stand-up paddle boards and kayaks that are taking a dump, not literally, but they're overturning, and they're kind of, these are folks from other places that realize that, all of a sudden I'm in the swamp. I'm not just in an open lake, and people have a tendency when you've got things all around your legs, legs that you can't see, to get a little bit panicked, and this is not an isolated incident. And so they actually mentioned, hey, would you have any interest in helping us with a grant for a weed harvester? So they actually applied for a Heritage Fund grant, and we're still waiting to hear what the likelihood of it is and how costs may get shared. But this is also a strategy that was identified by Game and Fish. They identified Watson Lake as one of the premier fisheries in the region and mentioned specifically reducing the aquatic weeds and algae to provide more accessible fishing shoreline. So there's another benefit from it. And so if we're able to capture that, there's a term that's been given to it called closing the nutrient loop. And so it's one thing to extract all of that, but the idea is really when you have something in abundance like that, not to think of it as a burden, but to think of it as an opportunity. So where can we use that? Who needs a whole bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus? Well, in the Midwest, when municipalities or counties do their cleaning, they'll often go out and drop this in open lots, and the local nurseries run after it because they've actually done studies back there that show when you have that as the base, these aquatic weeds as the base of your compost, that it increases production in tomatoes. And so that's the type of approach I think is going to benefit all of us from a cost perspective, but also from turning that into a burden into an opportunity. And so I've talked with folks that are farmers down on the Verde or work with folks that farm on the Verde, and they're really interested. And so part of this may also include things like sampling to get an idea of what kind of volume we can produce, so that if we can deal with this in mass and cut our costs while providing benefits to farmers that aren't necessary, or nurseries, or whatever the end user may be, where they're not using mined and chemical fertilizers, but this sort of stuff, I think it's a win-win all the way around. And just for reference, this bottom right picture is from the Central Arizona Project. They do this on a regular basis because those canals get a lot of warmth and have a lot of nutrients in them through the wildlife and other. And so this is a regular practice for them as well. So it was interesting. It's also being done over in the White Mountains. I'm not sure if it's Luna Lake. Game and Fish does it over there. So I'll be conversing with those folks as this may or may not become part of our future. And then there's kind of more meh. Alum treatments are pretty effective, and it's kind of a standard practice where you go out and you put alum out in the water, and it basically binds with the phosphorus so it's not available to continue in that nutrient cycling loop. And it takes a number of different applications and has a pretty strong track record. I'm not that familiar with it yet, and so I've got some homework to do. Would be really, I would anticipate that our ultimate management plan will have some combination of those three things in place. The only other thing here that I don't have a slide on would be dredging. That's been a hot topic for a long time. We're currently making sure we've got adequate samples of that sediment so we know what we would be potentially dredging. But from a cost perspective, it's really at the far end costliest of the spectrum. So we're not eliminating it from possibility, but the cost prohibitiveness of it may eliminate itself on its own. We'll wait and see. At this point, our job is to keep all our options open and figure out what's going to work best in this setting. In the meantime, I think it's important to note that as a city, we're not just sitting on our hands waiting for these reports to drop. When you look at our creeks being impaired for E. coli, fecal indicator, the city has recognized that our Sundog wastewater treatment plant, which has historically been our kind of main powerhouse for our wastewater collections and treatment, is not going to meet our city's needs going forward. And so centralizing that over to the airport, getting it away from Watson Lake specifically, has been in the offing here for a while now. And we're seeing very methodically the Public Works Department is going through and identifying these things, and we're upgrading our sewer infrastructure to accommodate the larger volume that we are realizing today, not even to mention what's coming down the line, but also to replace what in some cases is vitrified clay pipe that has 4-foot junctions. And so you've got vulnerabilities every 4 feet with much larger heavy-duty polyethylene in many cases, seamless. It's actually melted into place, dropped into the ground. And so that is an important strategy as we go forward to deal with E. coli in the creeks. In other areas like Miller Creek right here and on Granite Creek, they've been doing things like pipelinings, cured in place pipelinings. They actually have these little devices, little robots that go in and spray a pipe liner through it and make a seamless lining of that pipe. And our initial results that we were seeing from E. coli loadings and microbial source tracking in Granite Creek, where this was done about 3 years ago, are very encouraging in terms of the number of human markers is dropping off the table, and we're seeing much more avian and other things showing up. So it's complementary, but upgrading those systems is going to be really important as we go forward. From Granite Creek Park all the way up to the Miller Valley Road crossing, that's one of the next phases. And so that's an area that sees heavy load uses. So being able to address that and minimize those potential for leaks is an important part of the city's strategy going forward. One of the things that we touched on very briefly when I was describing the MS4 is it's called post-construction best management practices, stormwater controls. So commercial, subdivision, they are all required to have those two things, the stormwater quality and the stormwater volume, addressed in their development. And that's great to have it installed once, but we need to make sure that that's being actively maintained. A lot of these features are maintenance intensive. Some of the ones that are cheaper to the developers, it's easy to throw in a filter in your storm drain outlet, but it requires much more maintenance than a little detention pond like we have here at Superstition Meadery out by the airport. And then there's also the kind of quality control that happens. This is in a catch basin sump, so water goes into a domed grate in a little vegetated area. It drops down there, and this hood actually provides somewhat of a mechanical, physical separation. So the floatables would not be able to kind of go under and through and discharge into the creek. And so the sediments would drop out. And so we have to go and make sure that these things are installed properly. And this looks like a really clean application here, but the maintenance for it is missing. And so without that in place, that whole thing is non-functional. And so you can have the best of intention, but if we're not paying attention to those details, we're not going to realize any of the stormwater benefits, the water quality benefits that they were designed to have. And so what are we at, about 80 total sites, Oren? 65. It just feels like 80. But we've got new ones coming on every year. And so it's going through that design and build process. So in the design process, we're identifying the features that the city needs, giving designers, if they're not putting them into their plans, giving them ideas about what would be acceptable to the city with regards to stormwater treatment, stormwater volumes, working with those designers, whether it's the donut shop on Whipple or the next Antelope Crossing or Walden Ranch. We're trying to make sure that these issues are dealt with on those sites and then maintained on a regular basis. And then other places that we're starting to see this, and I've been pleased that within the Public Works Department, we've recognized that this isn't a one-off thing that you tuck over at the rodeo grounds and say, okay, we've done our job. This needs to be something that's integrated into almost every street reconstruction that we have. And so on the bottom here is the intersection of Carlton and Montezuma Street. This is the school, right? Well, Granite Creek's here, the bridge going over to Mile High Middle School. what we're doing in these cases, particularly as we're close to some of our impaired waterways, is starting to incorporate some of the green infrastructure in a way that is both pedestrian and bike friendly. And so it also lessens our potable water use in these landscape areas. So it doesn't show quite as well as I'd hoped here, but we actually have these kind of curb cuts in all of these landscaped areas here, so that as water comes down this curb line, it'll go through, water this, and then it'll pop out on this side, go down before going into the creek. So it's just one more treatment chance before it drops into that creek. And likewise on this, we got a curb cut here that's gonna come down and then drop it over here. And that goes on all the way up to the Cortez intersection and kind of wraps around the curb towards City Hall. Now, fortunately, this isn't new science, so to speak, but it's newer science. And so for a lot of construction outfits, some of these ideas are a little bit different than what they're accustomed to. This isn't the standard vertical curb. There's some important considerations that have to be made. And we're seeing a lot of municipalities and other organizations step up and create standards. This excerpt is from the Mesa Low Impact Development Guide. And this is more of a user-friendly one, kind of identifying, they've got neat matrices of what kind of benefits there are, where you can see them, what they look like when they're working. And there's another one that was recently released through the Greater Phoenix area. The Arizona State University's Sustainable Cities Initiative was heavily involved with it. And what's cool about that one is that it also includes standards for construction. And so that's kind of making a leap from conceptual to the practical, how do we build this? How do we include these on our plan sets so that the folks out on the street that are setting the curb framing understand this is what the opening needs to be, this is what the angle of the lip needs to be. Those are all really critical components. And we actually are doing a little in-house project. So a lot of the bigger projects the city does will farm out to a design that is called a design bid build. We'll have an engineering firm do the design work, we provide review, then it'll go out to bid and a local construction company will win that bid and build it. We also do a fair number of projects in-house. I'm nestled within the Public Works engineering team, and so we've got engineers, surveyors, CAD specialists, and we will actually do design on different portions of roadway. And right now we've taken on, at the Sundog Transfer Station, a project there. And there's a median island in that area. And our director said, the folks on the ground kind of wanted to get rid of it because when people are backing up, it can be a little bit of a nuisance. Our director said, no, let's utilize that. Let's make it an example. What better place than at the dump do you have green infrastructure, right? That's where a lot of pollutants are. And so they came back to us, and Orrin and I were able to sit down and go through a number of these features and design a median curb that will be collecting stormwater. And we're also going to use some of the recycled concrete there to demonstrate uses of recycling urbanite, as it's sometimes called, to address that heavy pollutant load that exists there. And so those are kind of the cool things that we were just banging our heads together over that design the other day. And it's the type of stuff that gets me excited, one, because of the realization from an organization, from the public works side of things, that this is something we need to do, but it doesn't have to be a stretch or a singular isolated application. That all of a sudden it's becoming the norm instead of the exception. So those are important steps going forward. Here's another cool one that Christy has been chairing from the very beginning. A number of private individuals, including Christy Everson, who's sitting in the audience here to my right, Prescott Creeks, Michael Bird's been there from the early days, have realized that that Greenbelt Trail we have going through the heart of downtown is really an unpolished jewel, and that it can really be a focal point, as it is in many other communities, Riverwalks, It's been mostly an afterthought. The trail's been in great condition and used, but it's an asset that could be so much more. Not only from just a ecological or hydrologic perspective, but from the business perspective of connecting businesses to the creeks, making the city more walkable. So when people come in, they can park their car and leave it for the whole day rather than shuffling from parking spot to parking spot. We can walk down by a babbling creek to get to that next creekside business. And so Christie and the city formed a group together to look at that. And we brought in Natural Channel Design out of Flagstaff. They'd worked with Prescott Creeks previously on reimagining and redesigning Watson Woods to making it a more functional riparian area with wetlands and riparian forests. And so we're looking at this and we're handcuffed in many regards. We don't have a lot of room to play with. So it limits some of the options that we may have that, or we may not have that were available to Watson Woods and Prescott Creeks. But it's important to bring in some folks who can bring their expertise to bear and say, hey, you've got opportunity here. These are some of the things that we can do. And the cool thing about this that I've really enjoyed is that I'm seeing a lot of continual action from the city side, but also from the business and private individual side as well. We've had a number of landscape companies come in and work with us to reduce the Siberian elm, to get it kind of nudged back to a more historic and natural kind of mixed riparian forest. And we actually won an almost $80,000, didn't when we were awarded, an almost $80,000 Arizona Water Protection Fund grant. One of the cool things about these grants is that they identify a whole bunch of different approaches on how to improve Arizona's waters. And this initial grant is designed at master planning so that we know what the community wants, what's physically possible, what are some of the hydrologic, ecological goals for it, but how does it also serve as a connection to us residents and the visitors here. And so this is a planning effort that's we're on the verge of. And so as we mentioned earlier, a big part of this is public involvement. And so if these are things that interest you, the master planning effort that's going to be coming with that is an opportunity to have your voice heard. So many of the strategies that we use for water quality are one and the same with water conservation as well. We're looking at re-establishing hydrologic and ecological function in these areas. In doing so, it helps slow that water down, spread it out, sink it in, and increase the perennial nature of our streams. In 2 months from now, hopefully it won't be the case, but a lot of our creeks are reduced to isolated pools. That's where pollutants can kind of feed on themselves and really bloom. So working with green infrastructure on those side streets, like at the Carlton Montezuma that I just mentioned, but all up and down will help kind of feed that creek so we have a continuous perennial trickle going through there. That benefits the long-term water potential, increases water presence, both in the volume and the extent of it as well. So this is a really cool opportunity. I'm excited for the next steps of it. I don't know where it's going to go, but that's part of the fun of it. And I think having the imagination to just come at it with a fresh perspective is what I'm going to enjoy. Other ways of getting involved. Next weekend, right now, there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of people scouring the creeks in support of Prescott Creek's annual Granite Creek cleanup. This has been a valuable service not only to the city, but to the waters that we all enjoy. And so if you haven't had the opportunity to do it, I really encourage it. It's a really cool community focal point. It draws people from every possible demographic, but they're all out there with the same good intent, which is something that I really appreciate. Other ways of getting involved seems kind of simple, but You have, let's see, we got 50 times as many eyes out there as I have here, and increasingly I'm glued to a computer, unfortunately. So when you're out walking your dog or out taking a hike, if you see something that doesn't look right, don't second guess yourself. Our website, City of Prescott's website, has a pollution reporting form. You're able to upload photos. You can provide approximate location. If you want to submit it anonymously, I would encourage, I don't care if your name's tied to it or not. We just need that information so we can get out and investigate, make sure this isn't an ongoing or chronic issue. We can correct it if it's just a one-off. We can do some education too if it's a property owner related issue. If you provide your contact information, I'll provide you updates on how we resolved it or what the issue was, or if it wasn't an issue, and many times it's not. But really appreciate, I have cards just next to the doggy waste bags, and there's a shortcut on there to get to that website as well. Super easy, City of Prescott West website, how do I report, and then pollution will get you right there. The website also, prescott-az.gov, has a lot of other great resources. This one that Prescott Creek's put together is really kind of a go-to because it addresses so many different components of it, from being responsible pet owners. Feel free to grab some of those. I've got a ton of the pet waste dispensers. It seems like a small thing, but a lot of our dog walkers are using those areas. A lot of them are very responsible. Some of them aren't. And so I encourage folks that don't walk dogs, if you see regular deposit spots, leave one hanging on a branch by it. I leave it in the pocket parks. We're all over the place with those. But there's also a lot of industry-related information sheets. Dealing with grease from restaurants, that's a continuing effort that we have to deal with because it's going straight down into the creeks. Automobiles, we've got a ton of cars out there and almost every one of them drips at least once. So dealing with those issues are something, and so we've got information sheets about all this, and this is how we go out and speak to industry, these different commercial sectors, to try to point them in the right direction. We want to work cooperatively to make them understand why they should be changing essential behaviors. Here's a slightly different one. If you don't want anything to do with the city, this is one that Department of Environmental Quality put out. It's a phone app that allows you to do citizen science based on the water that you're seeing out there. So it's you pull it up, and it'll ask you questions about, what are you seeing? Are you seeing signs of trash? Is it more than a paint bucket full or less? Is there signs of wildlife? Are there other things? And then you can take pictures and upload it. And then you can actually go to a website and see where other people are reporting. This is very blurry, but that's the Flagstaff area. And it looks like somebody's class got out and took a report every 50 meters. And so, but it's really kind of a cool snapshot to go out and see what's happening out on Aravaipa Creek or some other random spot in the state. But this is something that they're increasingly utilizing to be proactive in identifying potential pollution issues, just like we are at the local level with the city's pollution reporting form. They also want to know what's really good out there too, because we do have those outstanding Arizona waters that have that incredible ecological function, water quality, all of it kind of paired in one spot. So I think that's enough. I lost complete track of time. So as I mentioned, one of the things I was really looking forward to and would encourage are questions, because I'm kind of deep in the weeds on this stuff. And so hearing your perspectives, your curiosities, your questions, it's a good bit of adjustment for me to make sure I'm not overlooking these things or that I'm focusing where I should as well. Yes?
A question about the, trying to think what street it is, some of the new construction where they're putting the islands with vegetation in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you know why they didn't maybe do curb cuts in those to, again, capture some of that water.
So, which ones? So some of the recent ones where we do have them, Alarcon, particularly by Washington School. Some of those curb cuts, they're not quite as obvious a curb cut because they have a metal plate over the top of them that serves a water backing purpose. But that southern part of Alarcon from Willis on to the south has been really functional. My colleague Orrin actually was with Prescott College and they did a tour on it. We're new at this as well, and so some of these sites work really well, and others still need some more attention and better thought. And we've got a little bit of both of it on Alarcon, and we're starting, as I mentioned, Carlton Cortez, the Marina Street project next to the Elksier. There's a small rain garden there as well. Trying to think what else is in the offing. And that's another place where you actually would have opportunity as the public. Every one of these public construction projects have open houses. And that's an opportunity they listen to what you bring to them in those settings, whether it's as a resident of that street or a resident of the community. Making the call for those kind of things is something that travels up the chain.
Okay, since I have the mic, I want to ask one question.
Yeah.
On the lakes, the fact that dissolved oxygen goes to 0 below 10 feet implies to me that there's some nutrient loading that's also coming up from the lake bottom, which was the result of deposits from the wastewater effluent. So if you can stop nutrients coming in from the creeks, but it seems, is it true that you're still going to have a contribution to nutrients from the bottom? And if you're not going to dredge it, or can you cap that off? What's being done on that?
So that's the tricky part about the lakes, as Gary just described. You've got a 100-year backlog to start with, and then you've got the ongoing stuff. So the watershed stuff deals with what's kind of the new stream coming in. To deal with those sediment loads, we'll see what the report says with regards to the dredging opportunities. That's not been eliminated, as I mentioned. The alum treatments do help cap and trap some of those the nutrient availability down below, so it doesn't have the potential to bond and trap oxygen at those levels. So that's one potential. And the other thing is that doing the weed harvesting, those nutrients go into those primary producers. And so basically it's the long run game of those are going to be feeding those aquatic plants, the algae and all that stuff. And so continually harvesting all that stuff will eventually draw down on some of those sediments.
Right, or bentonite or some kind of cap material, is that in the...
I don't know if that's even a possibility. That'd be an interesting thinking about having a cap like that. I haven't seen that come across yet, but that's not to say that it hasn't. I haven't seen a draft on that level. As I mentioned, that's also the last kind of deliverable we're seeing since of the staggering of it.
My question is, how do you work with the street repairing people? In my neighborhood, we had a rash of resurfacing.
Mm-hmm.
And when it rained, this orange stuff came running down the street. And in many places, the pebbles are not even that secure in whatever base they use, and they're just all over the place. And this is in Prescott Lakes, and I live on Magnolia, just north of, or just south of Willow Lake.
So that brings up some interesting kind of points of responsibility. I'm not sure of your exact neighborhood, but in many cases, the streets are owned and maintained by the HOA. And so, not in yours, okay. But that is a significant consideration. So the vast majority of Timber Ridge, which impacts Manzanita Creek, the vast majority of Hidden Valley and Hazley that are impacting Banning Creek. So in those instances, we don't have as much input. And so it depends on the different types of treatment. There are a myriad of them in terms of the different surface treatments, chip seals, mill and fill, all of these things. And so we've got an ongoing pavement preservation program, and we work with our streets crews or the contractors that come in and do that. We do set up erosion and sediment controls, and so they're supposed to be protecting the outlets, the catch basins from this stuff going in. They're not supposed to be doing it within so much time of a rain event. So those are the kind of considerations that happen. But if you see something that's concerning, I'd encourage you to call Public Works or even do the pollution reporting form. Because like in something like that, you can say this neighborhood. You don't have to, I'm perfectly happy giving you a call and giving you an update once I've learned. Like I said, I can't be out on each and every one of these sites. And the folks that are out there have a different perspective and priority than I do. And so being tuned into those potential issues is really valuable. So I would encourage you, if you're not sure, give me a call or fill out the form. Because I'd rather go out and say, oh, no, it's not an issue and here's why. That's the best of all possible worlds. But if it's a programmatic issue that we need to address as a process, then that's also a good thing for us to tackle, to have an improvement, not just there, but ongoing. Yes?
Oh, wait. Sir, I'll bring to you next.
Oh, sorry.
I've heard that there's a significant backlog of very old clay pipe that has not yet been relined or replaced. Can you talk about the dollar cost that might be involved in updating and bringing all of the whole system in compliance for all of the Prescott area?
So it's not necessarily that we're out of compliance, we just have antiquated infrastructure. And so compliance would suggest that there are detectable and direct leaks associated with that, and there may be in many cases. And so the wastewater treatment plant operates under an aquifer protection permit. It's similar to some of those other permits. So they have some of their own reporting requirements. But the upgrade is a known issue throughout the area. And so what our wastewater collection staff do and utilities manager is they've got a menu, they've gone out. One of the things that happened a while back is that they brought on camera crews. And so the camera crews don't just go out to where problems are, they are going out and cameraing all of our sewer lines methodically throughout town. And they have a prioritization that starts with the older stuff and then goes to newer stuff. And so what that camera crew is doing is setting the table to identify what's going to be fixed next. I don't have a dollar estimate on it. Miller Creek and Granite Creek were the most recent sites where that was done. But I'd have to touch base with our folks and our wastewater superintendent to get dollar figures.
Yes. You talked about the Sundog waste treatment plant.
Mm-hmm.
You made it. Does it still release sewage into Watson Lake, or is that a thing of the past?
It's a thing of the past.
And when did that end?
It was ended in the 80s, I believe, went for about 50 years.
Oh, okay.
And so that is a thing of the past. They're treating to a level that allows them to send it down toward the airport area where it's recharged.
Right.
And so that actually ties into our kind of the ADWR, essentially our water bank account of alternative water versus groundwater. So that's where it's being used currently.
Right. So the algae blooms we see there every summer are the same nutrients recycling inside the lake.
It is. And one of the things that graph did point to was that kind of cyclical. So let's see if I can, it's gonna, oops. So one of the things that happens is that all right. Let's see if I can grab it real quick for you. So what happens is about this time of year, the ambient nitrogen levels, the total nitrogen, nitrates, nitrites, and Kjeldahl nitrogen drop out because all of the plants are using it. Where are we at? Yeah, they're starting in their big growth cycle. So all of those nutrients are being extracted or absorbed into their growth. And so it's coming out of the water for that. So I know it's difficult to see here, but I think this is November. This puts us right around to the April-May timeframe. And that's where our nitrogen levels are dropping off the bottom because that big wave of primary production is really starting off right now. And so there's not nearly as much available in the water because it's all being used. This is ambient water monitoring, not sediment monitoring. And so then over time, you get into that January, February, and you get your temperature drops. And so all of those aquatic plants go dormant, start decomposing and releasing those, and that's when we see those spikes. So yeah, that's a cycle just as you described.
Watson Lake is listed as impaired, and you're required to become meeting water quality standards. Does the city have a vision for the lake beyond simply meeting the standards? You're a lake in the middle of a city, not quite in the middle, but maybe it'll be in the middle as we have more development around it. But is there a vision for use of that lake, more recreation on it, full body contact swimming?
So there's a number. So for the swimming, as a private lake, it was owned by Chino Valley Irrigation District, and they prohibited swimming as a private feature. We do have a full body contact standard on it, which is one of many reasons why swimming is currently prohibited. There's recreation liability and other things that I can't speak to. My goal is to eliminate that water quality component from it so that isn't a limiting factor. I think one of the important things that this process can bring about is realizing that management of that resource needs to be a coordinated effort. Because it has the Department of Water, the water quantity components of it, the recreational and kind of symbolic to the community, as well as the water quality. All those things really need to work hand in hand. And that's something that we can improve on as a city because recreation services has their own mandates, their own different funding mechanisms than what we do in public works. So making sure we're coordinated and know what the other hand is doing, I think is an important outcome of this. I anticipate it being there.
Are city officials excited about using it, or is it simply we got to meet the standard and the ADWR is on top of us, or ADEQ is on top of us?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that the city recognizes the value of it. It's been reiterated through recent Save the Dells efforts as well for that whole area, not specific to the development to the north there. So I would anticipate, and I can't speak for council, but they recognize the value and potential of it just as we are that downtown Granite Creek corridor. These are incredible community assets that we look forward to utilizing on a regular basis. I think it will be and is a priority for them. How we as a staff bring information to them and present them both opportunities and limitations or requirements, that's on us to help them make kind of those informed decisions.
As these plans complete that you're building, what sort of timeline projections will be available for water improvement?
That's a tough one. Can you tell me how much is going to rain for the next 5-10 years? To really break it down to the simplest of sciences, the dilution is solution. The more water we have, the lower our pollution concentrations are. So, right now we've been out monitoring and we're achieving surface water quality standards in all of our creeks. It's not unusual. Putting a timeline on some of these things is difficult. You're going to see I can put a timeline on when the new sewer lines going in from Granite Creek Park to Miller Valley Road. That's an incredible extent of antiquated and undersized sewer infrastructure that has the potential for leaks. And so I can forecast that we'll see less, if we go back and do repeat microbial source tracking, I would predict a significant drop in human markers after that goes into place. But there's a number of other things at play that, create those human markers in that area. One of which Prescott Creeks recently got a grant to help address is homeless populations in the area not having adequate resources to facilities, where they tend to occupy along the creek course. And so they were able to secure an ADEQ grant, and we're about to see those doors open. Are we close? Soon. So, and that's another one of these issues where I heard someone speak to the social justice. These are more social issues than specific. I mean, they're not just social issues; they're also water quality issues, and one can feed the other. So, by having restroom facilities that are open and available to the public, that are found in that area, whether they're me going for a bike ride after work or somebody waiting for the shelter to open, that's a significant pollutant being pulled away from that creek into a more humane setting behind the bathroom stall. So that's going to have an impact on it. Prescott Creeks is working with Prescott College to do monitoring associated with that so that we can start to see, is it showing up? Is that effect going to manifest itself in our water quality? So there's those kind of things. But I take a holistic approach, and these are all pieces of it, but we also have to be looking at the behavioral issues. Wherever our street or operational, where's the street sweepers going? Are people picking up after their pets? Are people taking care of their sewer cleanouts backing up in a timely fashion? Or are they letting them persist for days and days and days? All of these things contribute, so I would anticipate seeing an improvement, but I don't know if there's any singular timeline I can give for that. We should be moving it forward, definitely, but how that peaks and tables, I can't predict yet.
So, yeah, Michael Bird with Prescott Creeks. Gary just asked me if I wanted to comment as well. And I think you ask a great question, is what's the timeline? How are we going to get this fixed? My organization has been around for almost 30 years, and we've been working on this water quality component for probably the last 10 or 15. And so I'm really encouraged that we're here today hearing about plans that the city has on board. The city has spent, I don't know what the price tag on all this work has been, but it has not been insignificant.
No.
And so when we first started talking about the water quality issue, there was a lot of confusion, and people were saying, why is this a big deal? And I think a lot of our initial work was just getting the community to understand that these are things that we actually need to pay attention to, because not fixing them was going to have negative impacts to the community over the long term. And the sooner we could kind of get the wheels turning on trying to figure out what are the issues and how do we as a community start addressing them, the sooner we'll get there. And so I think Matt's done a great job of kind of explaining how all these components fit together, how we as community members all play a part. It's not just the city. When are you going to have this fixed, Matt? I want to get out there and swim in the lake. It's just we all play a part, and it's kind of, as Matt has said, it's kind of this long view, is if we keep working toward it, we will get there eventually. And the smarter we can get about what we're doing on our landscape collectively as a community, the more benefits that we draw from it. Just look at any promotional material for the city of Prescott. It's either got Thumb Butte or it's got Watson Lake on it, or Willow Lake, or the Dells. And so community assets is really what we're talking about here. So I applaud the city. Thanks for the opportunity. Hopefully we've got more questions for Matt.
And all very valid points. And one thing that we haven't really mentioned is that one of the main tools that the total maximum daily limit documents really pointed to as a means of addressing these pollutants on a large scale are the Watershed Improvement Council. And that was a group of including folks from Yavapai County. They have an MS4 permit, they have infrastructure, so they are also under some of the same obligations we are. The tribe, They report, as a sovereign nation, they report directly to the EPA, but they also have water quality imperatives. And then there's other groups, Prescott College, NGOs, that work together to identify opportunities and create a watershed improvement plan. And that initial watershed improvement plan really had a lot of foresight to it, and that they identified specific projects, and 3 or 4 out of the 5, all but one, were realized. One of which was the Rodeo Basin, the Adult Center, the Whipple Basin. All of these were assets for stormwater quality that were realized over time. And so that group took a little bit of a nap, and we're trying to wake it up again. And so we're working together with the county and other folks so that we're working cooperatively towards some of these goals. And I'm encouraged by some of the things that are going on in that venue.
More questions? Some up here. Let's let Art.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, did I understand you correctly to say that 2010 was the highest microbial load that was measured going into the lakes?
No, I didn't say that.
You said something about 2010.
Yeah, there was a fish kill that happened,
right.
and I can't remember if that was 2002 or 10. I'm conflating the 2 dates for some reason.
Does that relate to the amount of rain we get those years? 2010 was the last very heavy rain period that we had until this past winter.
So typically what we would see is when that pool is drawn down on Watson Lake to its shallowest, so the May-June timeframe, it's at its hottest. So all those plants are producing at their peak. They're just blooming, and so they are capturing tons of that oxygen. They're limiting the oxygen that's available. You've got high temperatures, smaller bodies of water. That's usually when you're going to encounter a fish kill. And so that was something that, and I think it was a beautiful shiner kill. It's a little minnow type fish. And so that was kind of the tipping point of really capturing Department of Environmental Quality's attention with regards to this lake and its need for some more strategic management to address some of those issues.
So there's no real way you can compare 2010 to this past winter that we had with all the precipitation.
Right, and it should be noted that, so I heard microbial in there, and so we're using microbial for the creeks. The lake itself doesn't have an E. coli impairment at all. It has nutrients. So basically, once in those creek settings, most of that data was collected in the early 2000s to the mid 2015 or so. Pretty droughty period, not a lot of connectivity in our creeks. We've got issues, we know that, but that specific hot and dry kind of period, droughty period, definitely helps those E. coli blooms kind of happen. Isolated pools are going to prevent aeration, so DO drops. So those were, pretty high counts at those times. With more water, we tend to see better readings. But as it goes down to the lake, the dilution of that E. coli makes it so that we haven't had an E. coli impairment on the lake that I'm aware of or on record.
Matt, you mentioned briefly the TMDL process. I tracked it a bit in the beginning, but I've lost track in recent years. So I need a little bit of an updating. If I recall, ADEQ published the TMDL. There was some pushback from the city. They hired their own consultant and quibbled a bit with the TMDL, and I kind of lost it after that. Can you kind of update us as to where they are in the report and what the city is accepting, what ADEQ published?
Doesn't really matter if we accept it or not. It's whether or not EPA approves it is the ultimate kind of metric for it. But prior to ADEQ submitting the TMDL to EPA for approval, and I think it was in, I want to say 15, I think it's 2015, the city and ADEQ met and disagreed. And so we have agreement in place to basically, there's deliverables for each side of this. We agreed that the TMDL document would go forward as is. We would do additional monitoring and modeling. We would also provide that data specifically to ADEQ so they could revisit their modeling as well that formed the basis of that TMDL document. So when we completed that annual cycle of monthly monitoring, as part of that agreement, we provided all that information directly to ADEQ. And I gave them a call and said, okay, are you good with this? Is there anything missing from this? I want to make sure you had it in whole. They've got it. I don't know where they're at on their end of things. There's timelines associated with each of those. And so there are some additional steps, and I'll be working with folks in the city to get together with DEQ to have that conversation to say, hey, let's keep this open line of communication first and foremost. Are we both meeting our sides with regards to these requirements? And what do the new data, in addition to what was already collected by NAU, U of A, and private firms, does that give us a more complete picture of what's going on here and what the best strategies are going forward?
Do you expect it to change the report?
I don't know the logistics of what it takes to deal with a report like that. It's an EPA recognized and accepted TMDL document. So I don't know that you necessarily go back on that, whether or not there'd be an addendum that gets into kind of bureaucracy I'm not familiar with.
Other questions?
Hi, Matt.
Hi.
There is a lot of development taking place. Are you confident that all the new developments are being designed and regulated, controlled with water quality standards in mind? Would you see that additional sorts of additions to, say, development agreements are needed to meet your objectives and your goals?
So a lot of these development agreements and new developments are actually very progressive when it comes to stormwater quality. They realize that a lot of these features can have multiple benefits with regards to open space. This is how you water your turf without using a ton of potable water. So in general, using deep wells in agreement, their development agreement and documents are available online at Spiritu Loci. I'd have to double check on that website. But if you go in and look at what their stormwater, water quality components are, it's what I'm asking every other developer, commercial or subdivision to do. And so these are, in other parts of the country, other parts of the state, these are really kind of common practices. And so it's starting to become more the norm and not the exception. So I'm seeing more and more of it with new development in particular. And so it hasn't been something I've had to go bang the table for. In most cases, the stormwater quality components are already in place. And I can have a conversation with some of those developers with regards to, okay, I'm not sure if I'm understanding how you're intending to use this feature. And there, some of those manuals that Mesa, Greater Phoenix area put together have a ton of them. Some of them are new to me, but they've got a lot of really cool ideas. And they're not difficult either. If you think about Prescott Lakes Parkway, say Blooming Hills, is it? You've got an elevated median in there with a nice honeysuckle bush kind of thing going the whole length of it. Instead of having it, convex, if you had it concave, all of a sudden you're harvesting that first flush of hydrocarbons off the road. It's things like that, using ribbon curb cuts instead of it. And so this is commonplace in Tucson in particular. They were front runners of it. Watershed Management Group, Brad Lancaster's group. So it's seeping into the mainstream. So it's not something that, even 3 years ago, it was something I had to be more vocal about when I saw new developments or new construction plans. The toolbox is getting deeper and more readily available to a lot of these folks.
That overlaps in terms of Cwag's interest in the efficient use of either reclaim or potable water.
Yeah. So both in the development world, but is also in our world with regards to doing beautification in the downtown area or in any place that's got a lot of walking traffic. making it a nicer place to walk, whether it's in North Prescott or here downtown.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Has everybody questioned out? Ellie, you get the last word.
Obviously, you're pretty busy with water, but I noticed about once a month on Sundays, just outside the airport, in the morning, they are burning some kind of red smoke, piles of stuff going up into the air. Is there a pollution reporting system for air quality in Prescott, or just to ADEQ? ADEQ?
ADEQ is the go-to for air pollution. So it's kind of a fine line. So if it's like a rock crushing operation where it's kind of spraying dust that's falling down into the immediate area, that's something that actually we would deal with through actually community development group. The city would deal with that. But for something like that, that's something we would actually report through DEQ. But I would encourage you to also consider using the pollution reporting form so that I can kick it over as well. And so, yeah, document. I don't know how that ties into burn days, burn permits, who's doing it. All of those things kind of come into question as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I think that concludes the program. Thank you, Matt, so much for coming to share this with us. And thank you all for coming. Have a good Saturday.